Top 3 bands John Lennon hated. John Lennon was an English singer, songwriter and musician who gained worldwide fame as the founder, co-lead vocalist and rhythm guitarist of the Beatles. The Beatles were the greatest musical act of the 20th century. His songwriting partnership with Paul McCartney remains the most successful in history. In 1969, he started the Plastic Ono Band with his second wife, multimedia artist Yoko Ono. John Lennon wasn't just a musician. Both during and after John's time with the Beatles, he was also an amateur music critic. Lennon had a complex relationship with the rock and pop scene. He loved to push boundaries but was quick to call out music or musicians he saw as inauthentic. Here are 3 bands John Lennon hated. The Rolling Stones. The Beatles and the Stones weren't just competitors, they hated one another. Lennon believed that the Beatles were more innovative and had a broader artistic vision compared to the Stones, who he felt were primarily focused on a blues-influenced rock sound. Lennon made an enormous number of ill-advised and often purposely controversial statements in his time. "We're bigger than Jesus." He loved to be seen as unique, a poet and a writer. He envisioned himself to be clearly superior to, not just a fellow Beatle Paul, but all other rock bands as well, and that included the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones were attempting to break into the charts at the same time as the Beatles. When asked how he felt about the Stones, Lennon mentioned liking Honky Tonk Woman, but said, "I think Mick's a joke." He then moved on to Jagger's acting work, which in itself was an insult, considering it he dismissed his music. "I'll probably go and see his films and all, like everybody else, but really, I think Mick is a joke." He went on to say he thought Jagger got jealous of the Beatles and started imitating them. "I resent the implication that the Stones are like revolutionaries and that the Beatles weren't," he said. "They are not in the same class, music-wise or power-wise, and never were." Steely Dan. Although Lennon was often seen as the smart one, Steely Dan saw through his contradictions. While Lennon promoted peace and simplicity, he didn't fully embrace those values in his personal life, making him a target for critics like Steely Dan and Frank Zappa, who took issue with his preachy tone. Steely Dan, known for their clever lyrics and sophisticated compositions, Steely Dan had a problem with Lennon's message in Imagine. Their song, Only a Fool Would Say That, was a direct response to what they saw as Lennon's idealistic and naive vision of a utopian world. Steely Dan's song, Only a Fool Would Say That, from their 1972 album Can't Buy a Thrill, was written as a critique of Lennon's 1971 hit Imagine. Donald Fagen portrayed Lennon as a naive aristocrat, whose calls for world peace seemed disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people. The song was said to mock the insensitive naivety of Lennon's message, particularly the irony of singing about no possessions from the comfort of his luxurious mansion. Blood, Sweat and Tears. Anyone who listened to the radio in 1970 knows Blood, Sweat and Tears, a band that mixed rock with a dynamic horn section. Also unique was Powerhouse frontman David Clayton Thomas, who had replaced founding lead singer Al Kooper. With Clayton Thomas, the band had a string of hits, including Spinning Wheel, You've Made Me So Very Happy, and a memorable cover of When I Die. John Lennon had a reputation for being critical of some bands that were widely praised. His music preferences were often unconventional, and he didn't always align with popular opinion. In fact, he once criticized a widely respected band. In a 1971 interview with Rolling Stone, Jan S. Wenner asked John for his thoughts on the state of rock music at the time. John admitted that he wasn't very familiar with contemporary rock and rarely listened to the top 10 charts. He found most of the music uninspiring, explaining that he only checked out new albums when he was working on his own music to see if there had been any significant developments. However, he felt nothing notable was happening, despite the presence of talented musicians. One band, in particular, that John criticized was the jazz rock group Blood, Sweat and Tears, a band that had been well received by critics. John bluntly stated, "I don't like the Blood, Sweat and Tears stuff." He went on to say that rock and roll was beginning to resemble jazz in terms of complexity, which he didn't appreciate. Lennon's solo work and his political activism were a huge influence on subsequent generations of singers.